You're listening to The Observing Eye. Pirate radio for the mind. Coming at you fresh from the computer hell cabin.
Hello, you beautiful lot. It's Friday, the 13th of September, 2024, and you're listening to episode 81 of The Observing Eye, coming at you live from the computer hell cabin. Every week we get psychological, philosophical, and all manner of introspective. I'm David, and this week we are diving into the nature of dualism and non-dualism. Please hold your excitement. So what exactly are dualism and non-dualism? And why do they matter in spiritual discourse? Let's break it down. We'll start with dualism. It's a concept that most of us are familiar with, even if we've never formally studied philosophy or religion. At its core, dualism is the idea that reality consists of two fundamentally different, often opposing elements. Think about the classic examples: good versus evil, mind versus body, light versus darkness, self versus other. It's a worldview that emphasizes contrast and division, believing that the universe is composed of two distinct and often competing forces. In Western philosophy, dualism has been a dominant lens through which reality is viewed. Perhaps one of the most famous examples is the dualism of mind and body, articulated by the French philosopher and all-round cheerful fellow René Descartes. He argued that the mind, the seat of thought and consciousness, is entirely separate from the body, the physical vessel through which we move and experience the world. This is where we get the term Cartesian dualism, which has influenced much of Western thought and science for centuries. In spirituality, we often see dualism expressed through the separation of the material and the divine. Many religious traditions, like Christianity, teach that the physical world and the spiritual world are separate realms, with heaven above and earth below, and humans are caught in the middle, just trying to reconcile the two. But then we have non-dualism, a term that may sound more unfamiliar, but has profound significance in many Eastern spiritual traditions. At its essence, non-dualism asserts that this separation we experience, the dualities of life, is actually an illusion. Non-dualism teaches that at the deepest level, there is no real division between things. There's only oneness, unity. To put it simply, in a non-dual worldview, everything is connected, everything is one. The apparent divisions that we see between you and me, between good and evil, between subject and object, are just that, appearances. They're constructs of the mind, not reflections of the ultimate truth of reality. This perspective is most commonly found in traditions like Advaita Vedanta, a branch of Hindu philosophy that emphasizes the non-dual nature of the self and the universe, or in Mahayana Buddhism's teachings on emptiness, where the idea is that all things are interconnected and lack independent existence. The idea of non-duality also crops up in mystical traditions within religions that on the surface might seem more dualistic. For example, in Christian mysticism, there are moments where mystics speak of uniting with the divine, losing the sense of self, and entering a state of oneness with God. So where does that leave us? If dualism emphasizes separation and non-dualism teaches unity, how do these two perspectives coexist? At first glance, they might seem completely contradictory. One insists on difference, the other on sameness. But as we'll explore in this episode, many spiritual traditions and thinkers have suggested that these two ways of seeing reality are not actually in opposition. Instead, they might represent different ways of understanding the same underlying truth. There's a richness that comes from holding both perspectives. After all, we do experience duality in our everyday lives: love and hate, joy and sorrow, success and failure. But many spiritual teachings also encourage us to recognize that beneath all these apparent distinctions lies a deeper oneness, a unity that transcends the pairs of opposites. So today we're going to take a deep dive into how these ideas, dualism and non-dualism, coexist, what they mean for us in our personal and spiritual lives, and how we can reconcile the tension between them in a way that enriches our understanding of both ourselves and the world around us. Well done. You have survived that ridiculously long introduction. But at least we've laid the groundwork for defining what dualism and non-dualism actually are. Now, we're going to take a step back and explore the philosophical foundations of these two concepts, starting with how they've shaped entire systems of thought in both the West and the East. First, let's begin with dualism, a concept that has been at the heart of Western philosophy and religion for centuries. One of the most well-known and influential formulations of dualism comes from the 17th century philosopher René Descartes. Descartes was the guy who famously said, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. His big idea was that there are two distinct and separate substances that make up our reality: the mind, or the soul, and the body. He argued that the mind is the seat of thought, consciousness, and self-awareness, while the body is just a physical vehicle that interacts with the material world. Descartes believed that these two things, the mind and the body, operate in entirely different realms. The mind is immaterial, while the body is purely mechanical. This separation is often referred to as Cartesian dualism, and it laid the foundation for much of Western thought, particularly in the fields of science, psychology, and theology. But dualism isn't just a philosophical construct. It also shows up in Western religious traditions, particularly in Christianity. In Christian theology, there's a strong sense of separation between the material and the spiritual, the human and the divine. Heaven and earth are seen as distinct realms, and humanity exists in a kind of tension between the two. We are beings of flesh, but we also possess a soul that is eternal, and that soul is seen as something separate from our physical form. In many Christian teachings, there's a clear dualism between good and evil, light and darkness, God and the devil. The material world is often seen as fallen or corrupt, while the spiritual world is pure and divine. This is why in many Christian traditions, the goal of spiritual life is to transcend the physical world, to seek union with God, who exists in a realm beyond the imperfections of earthly existence. The idea is that the soul must rise above the temptations and flaws of the body to achieve salvation. This division between spirit and matter, between good and evil, between heaven and earth, is at the core of a dualistic worldview, and it's something that we in the West have been deeply conditioned to believe, whether we're aware of it or not. Now, let's turn our attention to non-dualism, which offers a completely different perspective on reality. Non-dualism suggests that this separation between mind and body, between the material and the spiritual, is actually an illusion. In non-dualistic thought, there is no true division between things. Instead, all of reality is fundamentally one. Everything is interconnected and interdependent. One of the most prominent expressions of non-dualism comes from the Indian philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, a school of thought within Hinduism. The word Advaita itself means not two or non-dual, and it teaches that the ultimate reality, known as Brahman, is singular and indivisible. According to Advaita Vedanta, the sense of separateness we experience, the idea that we are individual selves separate from the world and from others, is an illusion, a product of ignorance. In reality, there is only Brahman, and everything else is a manifestation of this one unified consciousness. Advaita Vedanta teaches that the goal of spiritual life is to realize this truth, that the individual self, or Atman, is not separate from Brahman. In fact, Atman and Brahman are one and the same. It's through this realization, this awakening to the non-dual nature of reality, that liberation, or moksha, is attained. This isn't a theoretical concept for practitioners of Advaita. It's an experiential truth, something that can be directly perceived through meditation and spiritual practice. We also see strong non-dualistic ideas in Buddhism, particularly in Mahayana Buddhism's teaching of sunyata, or emptiness. Now, this concept of emptiness doesn't mean that things don't exist. Rather, it points to the fact that things don't exist independently or separately from everything else. In Buddhism, there's an emphasis on interconnectedness, the idea that all phenomena arise in dependence on other phenomena. Nothing exists in isolation. In this view, the dualities we experience, like self and other, subject and object, are seen as constructs of the mind, not as fundamental truths about reality. The self in Buddhist thought is not a fixed, independent entity. It's a constantly changing process that's deeply intertwined with everything around it. When we realize this, we can let go of the attachment to the idea of a separate self which is the root of much of our suffering. In Mahayana Buddhism, there's a strong emphasis on compassion, which naturally arises from the understanding of interconnectedness. When you realize that there's no real separation between yourself and others, compassion becomes the natural response to the suffering of others, because their suffering is, in a way, your suffering too. It's a beautiful example of how non-dualism isn't just a philosophical idea, but something that deeply informs how we relate to the world and to each other. And then we have Taoism, spelled with a T, an ancient Chinese philosophy that also embraces non-duality. The Tao, or the way, is the fundamental principle that underlies everything in the universe. In Taoism, the ultimate reality is beyond all dualities. It's neither good nor bad, neither light nor dark. The Tao simply is, and it encompasses all opposites within itself. Sounds kind of odd, but bear with me. Taoism teaches that harmony comes from recognizing and accepting the natural flow of the universe, rather than resisting it or trying to impose rigid distinctions. The yin-yang symbol is a powerful representation of this idea. It shows how dualities like light and dark, male and female, are not separate or opposing forces, but are interconnected and complementary aspects of the same whole. In many ways, non-dualism asks us to transcend binary thinking. It invites us to see beyond the divisions that our minds create and to experience the deeper unity that underlies all of existence. So, when we look at these two perspectives, dualism and non-dualism, it's easy to see how they could seem like polar opposites. Dualism insists on separation, while non-dualism insists on unity. But here's the thing. Both of these perspectives are deeply rooted in human experience. We do experience duality in our everyday lives. We feel separate from others. We struggle with opposing forces within ourselves. We encounter conflict and division. But at the same time, many spiritual traditions tell us that beyond these surface experiences of duality, there is an underlying oneness. The coexistence of dualism and non-dualism is not about choosing one over the other, but rather about recognizing that both are valid ways of understanding reality. Dualism describes the relative world, the world of experience, where opposites exist and interact. Non-dualism, on the other hand, points to the absolute truth, where all distinctions dissolve and everything is one. And now, a word from our sponsor. This episode is sponsored by Athletic Greens. No, it's not at all, actually. It's sponsored by me and my book, which is out on Amazon, and you can purchase it as a paperback or on the Kindle, and it sits very much alongside this podcast. So if you're interested in philosophy and psychology and ways that these ideas can be applied to our lives in general, then the book is a really great place to get some theory and some practical applications of it. The premise of the book, we go through a few different scenarios. We talk about authenticity, about gratitude, about letting go of stuff. And there's a lot of Stoicism, there's some Buddhism in there, there's all sorts of philosophy and theology that covers this stuff. And the end point of it is for you to be able to reflect upon yourself and whether you are living according to how you would want to live organically, or whether you've adopted all of these frameworks and ideas that come from the external. God knows there's enough of those that hit us every day. So if you're interested in the podcast, if you're interested in that sort of thing, some philosophy, some psychology, and some actual uses of them in day-to-day living, then go and buy my book on Amazon. You have to just search The Observing Eye, or I will put a link in the show notes for you to go and have a look at that as well. And I'm hoping that you will find it useful. So yeah, go buy my book. Subliminal messaging. Buy my book. You will buy it. Yeah, but just see what you think. Or don't. It's entirely up to you. There's no pressure. I have no expectation here. It is out into the world and I have let go of it. So it is just there. It exists. And you may enjoy it if you so choose. Thank you for your time. And we now return to the transmission. Now that we've explored the philosophical foundations of dualism and non-dualism, let's bring these concepts into a more personal and experiential space, into the realm of psychology. Because beyond the abstract philosophical ideas, dualism and non-dualism shape the way that we experience life on a deeply psychological level. They influence how we see ourselves, how we relate to others, and how we navigate the challenges and conflicts that arise in daily life. Let's start by looking at dualism, just to follow the trend, and the psychological impact that it has on us as individuals. We often don't realize it, but dualistic thinking is woven into the very fabric of how we perceive the world. From a young age, we're conditioned to see things in terms of opposites and divisions, right and wrong, good and bad, self and other. This dualistic mindset can be incredibly useful for helping us navigate the complexities of life, but it also comes with its own set of challenges. One of the primary ways dualism shapes our psychological experience is by creating a sense of separation. In a dualistic framework, we're always categorizing things. This is me, and that is not me. This is what I want, and that is what I don't want. We divide the world into opposites, and in doing so, we reinforce the belief that we are fundamentally separate from everything else. We see ourselves as isolated individuals, distinct from others, distinct from nature, and even, sometimes, distinct from parts of ourselves. This sense of separation can lead to a lot of inner conflict and suffering. Think about it. When we view ourselves as separate from the world around us, we feel like we're in a constant state of competition or opposition. We have to defend ourselves, assert our identity, and protect what's ours. Dualistic thinking reinforces the idea that we are separate from others, which often manifests as feelings of isolation, loneliness, or even a sense of alienation from the world. Carl Jung, that famous Swiss psychologist, had a lot to say about the internal divisions we experience. Jung talked about the concept of the shadow, the parts of ourselves that we suppress or reject because they don't fit with the image that we want to present to the world. This is a form of dualism that plays out in our psyche. We create a division between the parts of ourselves that we accept and the parts that we deny, and this can create inner turmoil. The more we suppress the shadow, the more it influences our behavior in unconscious and often destructive ways. We see this dualism in the way we relate to emotions too. We label some feelings as good and others as bad. We chase after happiness and success, and we try to avoid pain and failure at all costs. But in doing so, we often end up caught in cycles of suffering because life inevitably contains both joy and sorrow, both success and failure. By clinging to one and rejecting the other, we create a constant state of inner tension. But what happens when we shift into a non-dualistic perspective? From a psychological standpoint, non-dualism can bring a profound sense of wholeness and integration. In a non-dual framework, we recognize that the divisions we create in our minds are ultimately illusions. This doesn't mean that we stop experiencing these dualities, but rather that we start to see them as interconnected aspects of a greater whole. Take emotions, for example. In a non-dual approach, we stop labeling our emotions as purely good or bad. Instead, we acknowledge that every emotion, whether it's joy or sorrow, has its place. Rather than rejecting pain or chasing after happiness, we learn to accept both as part of the full spectrum of human experience. When we embrace this kind of non-dual awareness, we often find that the suffering we experience from resisting certain emotions starts to dissolve. We're no longer in a state of conflict with ourselves. This shift towards non-dual awareness is something that many spiritual and psychological practices aim to cultivate. Mindfulness meditation, I bring this up a lot, is a perfect example. In mindfulness, we're encouraged to observe our thoughts, emotions, and sensations without judgment, without getting caught up in all of that dualistic thinking of liking or disliking, wanting or avoiding. Instead, we learn to see everything as part of the present moment, allowing things to be as they are without needing to categorize or control them. Non-dualism also has a profound effect on the way we relate to others. When we're stuck in a dualistic mindset, we tend to see ourselves as separate from other people. We create barriers between me and you, and this can lead to feelings of competition, comparison, and even conflict. But when we start to recognize the non-dual nature of reality, these barriers start to dissolve. We begin to see that we're not actually separate from others, but deeply interconnected. This realization of interconnectedness can lead to a natural sense of compassion. When we no longer see ourselves as fundamentally separate from others, we become more sensitive to their experiences, their joys, and their sufferings. The boundaries that create an us versus them mentality begin to soften, and we start to feel a deeper sense of empathy. In Buddhist teachings, this is referred to as compassionate awareness. The understanding that because we are all interconnected, the suffering of others is not entirely separate from our own. But it's important to note that embracing non-dual awareness doesn't mean denying the reality of duality. We still experience the world in dualistic terms. There's still day and night. There's still pleasure and pain. What changes, however, is our relationship to these dualities. Rather than getting caught up in the push and pull of opposites, we begin to see the greater context in which they arise. In fact, one of the most powerful insights from non-dual psychology is the idea that duality and non-duality are not mutually exclusive. They coexist. Yes, we live in a world where dualities are a part of our everyday experience, but at the same time, we can recognize that these dualities are interconnected aspects of a deeper unity. Think of it like this. From a dualistic perspective, life might seem like a constant battle between opposites. But from a non-dual perspective, these opposites are not in conflict. They are two sides of the same coin, both necessary and inseparable parts of the whole. This is why non-dual awareness often brings a sense of integration, because it allows us to embrace both the dualities of life and the underlying oneness that connects them. So when we think about the psychological impact of dualism versus non-dualism, we see two very different ways of experiencing the world. Dualism tends to reinforce feelings of separation, isolation, and conflict, both within ourselves and in our relationships with others. But non-dualism invites us to experience a deeper sense of wholeness, interconnectedness, and compassion. It encourages us to let go of the rigid categories and divisions that cause so much suffering, and instead to embrace the fluid, interconnected nature of reality. And I'm just kind of waving. I'm standing up doing the recording today. I thought I'd try something different so I can get far away and close up pretty easily. And I'm just waving my arms about like a sort of wavy waves, the interconnected nature of reality. Anyway, I'm going to stop dancing now. In the end, it's good I can dance when I'm recording. It's not about choosing one perspective over the other. Both dualism and non-dualism have their place in our experience. But by understanding the psychological effects of each, we can begin to navigate the complexities of life with more awareness, more openness, and perhaps even a bit of inner peace. So far, we've explored the philosophical and psychological aspects of dualism and non-dualism. So let's turn our attention to the realm of spiritual practice. For many people, spiritual practices are the bridge between theory and experience, the tools that help us navigate and even transcend the dualistic nature of the world, while also touching the deeper non-dualistic truths that so many spiritual practices point toward. One of the fascinating things about spiritual practice is that it doesn't just sit in the realm of belief or intellectual understanding. Practices like prayer, meditation, chanting, and rituals offer a way to experience both dualistic and non-dualistic realities directly within the framework of our daily lives. Let's start by looking at a few practices that are often grounded in dualism, but can also lead us to non-dual realizations. One such practice is prayer. In many religious traditions, prayer is an inherently dualistic act. When we pray, we're often addressing a higher power, God, the divine, the universe, whatever you want to call it, from the position of an individual self. There's a sense of separation. I am here and the divine is somewhere out there. And through prayer, I seek to connect with or appeal to this higher power. But what's interesting is that in many mystical traditions, prayer can also act as a doorway to non-dual awareness. The act of surrender in prayer, the act of letting go of the ego and opening oneself to a higher power, can lead to moments where the sense of separateness begins to dissolve. Over time, the boundaries between the self and the divine may blur, and prayer shifts from being a dialogue between two separate entities to a more profound experience of union or oneness with the divine. For example, in Christian mysticism, there's a long tradition of contemplative prayer, practices like centering prayer or the prayer of the heart, where the goal is not to ask for something or even to communicate in words, but to enter into a state of deep stillness and communion with God. Mystics like St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross describe experiences of being so united with God in prayer that the duality between the self and the divine disappears, and all that remains is an experience of pure, non-dual awareness. Another spiritual practice that bridges dualism and non-dualism is the use of sacred rituals and ceremonies. Rituals are often highly dualistic in their structure. They involve specific actions, words, and symbols that are designed to mark a distinction between the sacred and the profane, between the participant and the divine. Whether it's lighting a candle, offering incense, or performing a sacred dance, don't get me started on dancing again, rituals typically emphasize the separation between the individual and the transcendent. However, as with prayer, rituals can also serve as a way to transcend dualistic thinking. Take, for example, the Hindu ritual of puja, a devotional offering to a deity. On the surface, this is a dualistic act. The devotee is offering something to a higher power, acknowledging the difference between the human self and the divine. But in the deeper sense, puja is often seen as a way of recognizing that the distinction between the individual and the deity is illusory. The offering represents the symbolic dissolution of the self, as the devotee acknowledges that the deity is not separate from them, but is a manifestation of the same ultimate reality that resides within all things. In fact, many rituals across various traditions are designed to facilitate an experience of non-dual awareness. In Tibetan Buddhism, for example, elaborate rituals involving chanting, visualizations, and mandalas are used to help practitioners recognize the illusory nature of the dualities they perceive. The mandala, with its intricate geometric patterns, is often seen as a representation of the cosmos, and by meditating on it, the practitioner is invited to see the unity within the apparent multiplicity of the world. The ritual acts as a bridge, guiding the practitioner from a dualistic experience of reality to a non-dual understanding. Now, let's shift to another practice that is widely recognized for its ability to dissolve the dualistic boundaries between self and other. And it's not LSD, it's self-inquiry, or Atma-vichara, as taught in the tradition of Advaita Vedanta. Unlike rituals or prayer, which often start from a place of duality, self-inquiry is a practice designed specifically to deconstruct the very idea of the separate self. In self-inquiry, the practitioner continuously asks the question, who am I? But not in the ordinary sense of just trying to define oneself in terms of name, body, personality, or, what job they do. Instead, the question is meant to peel away the layers of identification with the mind and body, leading the practitioner toward the realization that the I that they think they are is not separate from the ultimate reality, or Brahman. As the practice deepens, the distinction between the individual self and the universal self begins to dissolve, leading to an experience of non-dual awareness. What makes self-inquiry particularly powerful is that it bypasses the need for external rituals or deities altogether. It's a direct path to non-dual realization rooted in the understanding that the self and the absolute are one and the same. There's no need to become anything because the non-dual truth is already present. It's simply a matter of recognizing it. While self-inquiry is a more solitary practice, other spiritual practices involve a communal element that bridges dualism and non-dualism. A perfect example of this is chanting, which is used in many spiritual traditions from Hinduism to Christianity, Sufism to Buddhism. On the surface, chanting might seem like a repetitive dualistic act. We chant words or mantras that invoke a divine presence, using sounds to create a sense of connection between ourselves and something greater. However, the act of chanting can often lead to an experience of deep non-dual awareness. As a practitioner becomes fully absorbed in the sound and vibration of the chant, the boundaries between self, sound, and the object of devotion begin to dissolve. Over time, the chanting becomes less about the words being said and more about the feeling of being merged with the sound, with the divine, or with the universe itself. Many practitioners describe reaching a state in which there's no longer a sense of me chanting. The chanting simply happens, and there's a feeling of unity with the entire experience. In this way, chanting starts from a place of duality, an individual chanting a mantra to a deity or a sacred concept, but can lead to an experience of non-dual immersion, where the separation between the practitioner and the sacred disappears. Lastly, let's explore a practice that is often overlooked in discussions of spirituality, but plays a crucial role in bridging dualism and non-dualism, and that's service or selfless action, known in Hinduism as karma yoga. Karma yoga is the practice of dedicating one's actions to the divine without attachment to the results, which on the surface is an inherently, again, dualistic practice. We perform actions in the world, we work, we help others, we create things. And we usually do this with a sense of individual effort, with a clear sense of self and other. However, the essence of karma yoga is to perform these actions with the understanding that the self is not the doer. When we engage in selfless service, the idea is to act from a place of unity with the divine, recognizing that the distinction between I as the doer and the world as the recipient of my actions is an illusion. Through this practice, the boundaries between the actor, the action, and the result begin to blur, and we come to realize that all actions are expressions of the same underlying reality. This is where karma yoga bridges the gap between dualism and non-dualism. On the surface, it's about doing, acting in the world and serving others. But on a deeper level, it's about realizing that the actions we perform are not separate from the divine flow of life. The more we engage in selfless action, the more we come to experience the oneness that exists beyond the dualistic framework of self and other. So, as we can see, spiritual practices across traditions often begin in dualistic terms with a focus on distinctions, individual and divine, subject and object, self and other, but many of the same practices offer a pathway to transcend those dualities and lead us into a direct experience of non-duality. Whether it's through prayer, ritual, self-inquiry, chanting, or service, these practices help us navigate the dualistic nature of our everyday experience while pointing us toward the deeper, non-dual truth that lies beyond it. As we move through life, we often find ourselves fluctuating between these two modes of experience, feeling separate one moment and then deeply connected the next. The beauty of spiritual practice, and why I personally feel it's so important, is that it provides us with tools to not only understand these fluctuations, but to transcend them, to experience the unity that underlies it all. So far then, we've looked at philosophy, we've looked at psychology, we've looked at some practical dimensions of dualism and non-dualism. Now we're going to get a little bit into the ideas of symbolism, and that brings us into myth and metaphor within spiritual narratives. Now, myths are the stories that we tell ourselves to make sense of the world, and metaphors are the tools we use to bridge the gap between the seen and the unseen. Throughout history, these stories and symbols have played a crucial role in helping us navigate the tension between dualism and non-dualism in spiritual thought. What's fascinating is that across many spiritual traditions, myths often begin in a state of oneness or wholeness, only to fracture into duality. But just as these stories reflect the movement from unity to separation, they also point the way back to a realization of non-dual reality. Myths and metaphors, therefore, serve as powerful guides that help us understand how dualism and non-dualism coexist and complement each other in our spiritual journeys. One of the most well-known myths of duality is the creation myth, and you can take any creation myth, any of them found across various cultures and religions. But we're going to start with the familiar story of Adam and Eve from the Judeo-Christian tradition. In this myth, the world begins in a state of unity. Adam and Eve live in the Garden of Eden, in harmony with God and all of creation. But the moment they eat from the tree of knowledge, they become aware of duality. They become aware of the distinction between good and evil, between themselves and God, between their bodies and the world around them. The fall from Eden marks a shift from a state of non-dual harmony to a life lived in the world of duality, where struggle, conflict, and division are now part of the human experience. But what's interesting about this story is that it doesn't simply present duality as a permanent state. In Christian thought, the story of the fall is followed by the promise of redemption, the idea that humanity can return to a state of unity with God. So even within this profoundly dualistic story, there is a thread of non-dualism, a recognition that the separation between humanity and the divine is not the ultimate truth, but rather a temporary condition that can be transcended. Stories like this show us that duality isn't just a philosophical concept, it's something that has been encoded into the stories we tell about ourselves and the world. The movement from unity to separation and then the journey back to unity is a powerful metaphor for the spiritual path, one that mirrors our own experience of life, where we often feel separate from others, from nature or the divine, but are ultimately seeking a deeper sense of connection and oneness. Another example of a creation story is from Hindu cosmology. In many Hindu creation stories, the universe begins as an undivided whole, often represented by a primordial deity like Brahman or Vishnu, resting in a state of pure potential. Out of this state of non-dual unity, creation emerges, often through a divine act of separation. In one version, Brahma, the creator god, divides himself to form the universe. The divine splits into many forms, each representing a different aspect of creation: earth, water, fire, air, and space, as well as living beings and the gods themselves. This act of creation is inherently dualistic, as it involves the division of the one into the many. But what's important to remember in these stories is that the division is illusory. It's all still Brahman. The many forms that we see in the universe are just different expressions of the same underlying unity. In this sense, Hindu cosmology teaches us that the world of duality is real only at the relative level of experience. At the absolute level, the oneness of Brahman remains unchanged. The process of creation, therefore, is not a fall from grace or a permanent division, but a temporary play of forms, what is called Leela, the divine play. And in this divine play, the goal of spiritual life is to realize the truth of non-duality, to see through the illusion of separation and recognize that all things are, in fact, one. We see a similar use of metaphor in Taoism, especially in the symbolism of the yin-yang. This ancient Chinese symbol is a perfect representation of the relationship between dualism and non-dualism. On the surface, the yin-yang represents duality. The black and white halves symbolize opposing forces. But the symbol is more than just a depiction of opposites. The two halves are interdependent and interconnected, with each containing a small circle of the opposite color, showing that nothing is purely one thing or another. The yin-yang teaches us that dualities are not rigid or fixed, but are in constant relationship with each other, always flowing and transforming. More importantly, the entire symbol represents the Tao, the ultimate reality that transcends all dualities. The Tao is neither yin nor yang, but the source of both. It's the non-dual ground from which all dualities arise and to which they return. Just like the creation stories in other traditions, the yin-yang symbol reminds us that the dualities we perceive in the world are part of a larger, non-dual reality that holds everything together in balance. And let's not forget about Buddhist narratives, especially in Mahayana Buddhism, which also offers very rich metaphors for navigating duality and realizing non-duality. One of the most famous stories is the parable of Indra's net, a metaphor that illustrates the interconnectedness of all things. In this story, the universe is imagined as an infinite web, with each node in the net holding a jewel. Each jewel reflects every other jewel in the net, so that no single jewel is independent or separate. Each is intimately connected to all the others. Indra's net is a metaphor for the Buddhist concept of emptiness or sunyata. Emptiness in this context doesn't mean that things don't exist, but rather that they don't exist independently. Everything arises in dependence on everything else. There is no separation, no duality between self and other, between subject and object. This metaphor shows us that while we may experience life as a series of separate events and entities, the ultimate truth is one of interconnectedness, where all things are reflections of one another in the vast web of existence. What's particularly powerful about these stories and metaphors is that they don't just tell us about dualism and non-dualism in an abstract way. They invite us to experience these truths for ourselves. Myth and metaphor bypass the logical, analytical mind and speak directly to our deeper, intuitive understanding. They resonate with us because they reflect something we already know at a deep level, that the divisions we experience in life are not the whole story. They remind us that beneath the surface of duality, there is a greater oneness that connects all things. In fact, this is one of the reasons why spiritual traditions rely so heavily on story and metaphor. It's not just about teaching us doctrine or theology. It's about guiding us toward a direct experience of the non-dual reality that lies beyond words and concepts. The stories and symbols we use are like maps. They point us toward the destination, but they are not the destination itself. The true experience of non-duality is something that transcends language, something that can only be lived. So when we look at these stories, whether it's the fall of Adam and Eve, the creation of the universe in Hindu cosmology, the yin-yang of Taoism, or the web of Indra's net, we see that they all carry a dual message. On the one hand, they acknowledge the reality of duality, the separation, the conflict, the distinctions we experience in life. But on the other hand, they also point us toward the deeper truth of non-duality, reminding us that beneath the surface of these apparent opposites, there is a greater whole. In many ways, myth and metaphor serve as connections between dualism and non-dualism, helping us to navigate the complexities of both our inner and outer worlds. They allow us to hold both perspectives at once, to honor the reality of duality, whilst also recognizing the deeper, non-dual ground upon which we all stand. As we've explored the coexistence of dualism and non-dualism through the lenses of philosophy, psychology, spiritual practice, mythology, it's very easy to see how these concepts have shaped human thought for millennia. But how do these seemingly abstract ideas apply to the modern world? What role do dualism and non-dualism play in our lives today, in a world filled with technology and social complexity and global challenges? In this section, we'll explore how these ancient perspectives are still deeply relevant, perhaps even essential, to navigating the world that we live in today. We'll start again with dualism because, keeping up the trend. If you look closely, you're going to see that our modern world is steeped in dualistic thinking. Dualism can be found everywhere. Our politics, our social structures, our technology, even in the ways we think about ourselves and others. Politics is a great one to use as an example. In many parts of the world, especially in the West, we've seen a growing polarization in political discourse. Everything seems to be framed in terms of us versus them, with opposing sides locked in a battle of ideologies. This is classic dualism at work. Good versus evil, right versus wrong, left versus right, red versus blue. Each side sees itself as correct, and the other as fundamentally flawed or even dangerous. Social media, which amplifies these divisions, also thrives on dualistic thinking. Algorithms prioritize engagement, and what drives engagement more than anything? Conflict. The more polarized we become, the more clicks, shares, likes, retweets, reactions, whatever else they call it, the platform generates. We are drawn into a cycle of dualism, constantly reinforcing the idea that there are clear winners and losers, heroes and villains. This kind of thinking, though useful in some contexts, can trap us in an endless cycle of division where the subtleties of human experience are reduced to binary choices. Now, if you listened to the podcast before, you might be asking yourself, but David, every episode you seem to bring up social media and criticize it in some way. And I say, yes, I probably do, because I think social media is shit. Technology itself often reinforces dualistic thinking. Think about the way that we've developed artificial intelligence or the way we approach machine learning. The world of computing is built on binary code, ones and zeros, yes and no, on and off. I like doing these little pairs of complementary opposites, as you're probably getting a feel for. Computing is a deeply dualistic system that mirrors how we've traditionally viewed problems and solutions in the modern age. We tend to think in terms of optimization, finding the most efficient solution, categorizing everything into distinct entities. While this kind of thinking has led to incredible technological advancements, it can also lead us to view the world in an overly mechanistic way, as if everything could be neatly divided and categorized. Of course, life isn't that simple. Human beings, relationships, and the natural world are far more complex and interconnected than dualistic thinking often allows. We can see the limitations of this approach in how we've dealt with issues like climate change. For years, there's been a dualistic mindset when it comes to humanity's relationship with nature. Humans on one side, the environment on the other. We've treated the natural world as something separate from us, something to be dominated, exploited, or managed. This dualistic mindset has led to the crisis that we now face. Now, here's where non-dualism becomes especially relevant in our modern context. At its core, non-dualism teaches us that the separation we perceive between ourselves and the world is an illusion. In reality, everything is interconnected. When we start to see through this non-dual lens, it transforms how we relate to the world and to each other as human beings. One of the clearest examples of this shift is in the growing awareness of ecological interdependence. More and more, people are realizing that the health of the planet is inextricably linked to our own well-being. We are not separate from the environment, we are part of it. Indigenous cultures have long understood this non-dual relationship, viewing the earth not as a resource to be exploited, but as a living, breathing system in which all parts are connected. This holistic non-dual perspective is essential if we're going to address the ecological crisis we face today. The idea that we are separate from the planet's ecosystem no longer holds up. Climate change, species extinction, deforestation, these are not environmental issues, they are human issues, because the lines between the natural world and human society are not as clear-cut as dualistic thinking suggests. We're also seeing a shift toward non-dualistic thinking in the realm of psychology and mental health. For much of modern history, the mind and the body were treated as separate entities. If you had a physical ailment, you saw a doctor. If you had a mental health issue, you saw a therapist. These two domains, physical health and mental health, were often viewed as distinct from one another. But today, we're recognizing that the mind-body connection is far more integrated than we previously understood. For example, the rise of holistic health approaches, which integrate practices like meditation, yoga, and mindfulness, reflects a more non-dual understanding of human well-being. We're learning that mental and emotional states can directly affect physical health and vice versa. Practices that were once considered alternative or even fringe, such as energy healing or somatic therapy, are now gaining mainstream recognition because they acknowledge the interconnectedness of mind, body, and spirit, an inherently non-dual perspective. The same can be said for trauma healing. Approaches like somatic experiencing or mindfulness-based stress reduction are based on the idea that trauma is not just stored in the mind, but in the body as well. There's a guy called Joe Dispenza who talks a lot about this, and his stuff is worth a look if you're interested in that kind of thing. Healing, therefore, requires an integrated approach that acknowledges the non-dual connection between mental and physical states. This shift towards non-dual approaches is helping us move beyond the limitations of treating the mind and body as separate systems. Another area where non-dualism is becoming more relevant is in I say emerging, but it's been around for quite a while, the field of quantum physics. While traditional Newtonian physics operates within a dualistic framework, describing the universe in terms of separate, independent objects, quantum physics has revealed a far stranger and more interconnected reality. At the quantum level, particles don't behave in the ways we might expect. They can be in two places at once, or they can influence each other instantaneously across vast distances, what Einstein called spooky action at a distance. The discoveries of quantum physics have shattered the illusion of separateness that traditional science once upheld. We now know that everything in the universe is interconnected in ways that defy our usual categories of time and space. In many ways, quantum physics points directly to a non-dual reality, one in which the boundaries between objects and events are fluid, and everything is part of a vast, interconnected whole. This kind of thinking is slowly starting to influence fields beyond science. It's showing up in how we approach business, leadership, and organizational dynamics. More and more, leaders are realizing that success isn't just about optimizing individual parts, but understanding how everything, people, processes, and systems are connected. This shift from a linear, dualistic approach to a more integrated, non-dual way of thinking is helping organizations become more adaptive, innovative, and sustainable. And perhaps one of the most personal ways we see the relevance of non-dualism in modern life is in how we relate to ourselves and others. In a dualistic mindset, we tend to think of ourselves as isolated individuals, but this mindset can lead to feelings of loneliness, alienation, and disconnection. Non-dualism, on the other hand, invites us to see ourselves as part of a larger web of relationships. It reminds us that we are not separate from others, but we are in fact deeply connected. This perspective is becoming increasingly important as we grapple with issues like mental health, social justice, and inequality. When we understand that our well-being is tied to the well-being of others, we become more compassionate, more empathetic, and more willing to take action for the greater good. The rise of collective consciousness movements, whether in the form of environmental activism, racial justice, or even global mindfulness initiatives, reflects this growing awareness of our interconnectedness. In a world where divisions often seem so stark, non-dualism offers a path towards unity, toward recognizing that we are all part of the same whole. So, what does all of this tell us? Dualism and non-dualism are not just ancient concepts confined to spiritual traditions or philosophical debates. They are alive and well in our modern world, shaping how we think, how we live, and how we relate to one another. In some ways, dualism is necessary. It helps us make sense of the world, categorize and organize. But as we face increasingly complex global challenges, non-dualism offers a way to transcend the limitations of dualistic thinking. It invites us to see the world as interconnected, to move beyond us versus them, and recognize that the divisions we perceive are often illusions. In this modern era, both dualism and non-dualism have their place, but perhaps the most powerful approach is to hold both perspectives lightly. To recognize that while we experience life in dualistic terms, the deeper truth is one of connectedness. This, in many ways, is the invitation of our time, to bridge the gap between dualism and non-dualism, and to live with the awareness that we are all part of the same indivisible whole. As we have journeyed through this episode, exploring the often paradoxical relationship between dualism and non-dualism, it kind of feels appropriate for me to do a bit of self-disclosure and take a moment to reflect on how these ideas have shown up in my own life. Dualism is something that in many ways shapes the way we all live day to day. It's present in the way we categorize and make sense of the world, but it's also something that can create inner conflict and division. And I've noticed this in my own personal journey. For much of my life, I found myself thinking in very dualistic terms, whether I was aware of it or not. It was there in how I saw my own goals and aspirations, in how I defined success versus failure, or even in the way that I viewed myself in relation to the world around me. There was a clear division between the me that I thought I was and the world outside of me, the external. It's so easy to get caught up in these distinctions because they help us to organize our experience. The problem is that they also create barriers. There was a period when I was really struggling with a sense of inner conflict, just feeling like I had to constantly strive to become a better version of myself. On one side, there was this drive for self-improvement, this kind of perfectionism, this desire to reach some as yet unidentified ideal version of myself. On the other side, there was frustration, because no matter how much I tried, I could never reach that perfect vision that I had manifested. This was dualism playing out within my own mind, a split between who I was and who I thought I should be. As Carl Rogers would say, this is huge cognitive dissonance between my actual and ideal self. Now, I think this kind of tension is something that many people experience, and please correct me if I'm wrong. It's this gap between where we are and where we think we're supposed to be, whether it's in our careers, our relationships, or our own kind of personal development. We create these internal divisions, these binaries, where one side is always better and more desirable, and the other side feels like something we just need to overcome or get rid of or shed. It's a constant push-pull, and it can leave us feeling fragmented or incomplete. But I got to a point when I began to question this approach. It was a point when the frustration overrided the perfectionism. I started to realize that the more I clung to this dualistic way of thinking, the more tension I felt. It was like I was dividing myself into pieces. I was Brahman becoming space and time and the universe and all the gods and living things, but it wasn't. It was just me, and I took off a t-shirt or something and it became me in the t-shirt. That's a really shit analogy, but you get what I mean. It's nothing quite as grandiose as I am Brahman. But I started labeling certain aspects of myself as good and others as bad, and certain emotions as acceptable and others as unacceptable. And the more I tried to fix this, the more disconnected I felt. And it was only when I began exploring practices that were rooted in non-dualism that things started to shift. And this was when I started getting into Buddhism and studying that pretty heavily. And as a result of that study, one of the biggest transformative experiences came through meditation. And it was sitting meditating, and it was like autumn, and it was a bit grey and shitty and cold and what have you. And I was caught up in that usual stream of thoughts and judgment and self-criticism. The thoughts arose, and I, like a young, naive fool, clinged to those thoughts. But then there's something that I read years back came into my mind, and it was this book from the 1960s on Hatha Yoga. The very first chapter, I remember reading it, I was about 11 years old. And I remember reading this chapter, the very first chapter in this book. And the exercise was to get a piece of fruit. Couldn't be man-made, couldn't be artificial, it had to be natural. So like a flower, a leaf, or, something natural. So I got an apple, okay? And the exercise said, you've got to just like look at this apple and just look at it and observe it, and don't think about what it is. Just observe the apple. Just come to understand it. And of course, as a kid, I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? Just look at an apple for half an hour, mate. Like, fucking what's this? But it taught me something. And it taught me that my concept of what an apple is, the construct of an apple in my mind, was just a fucking illusion, right? It's just a construct. If I say to you to imagine an apple, imagine a banana or something like an avocado, because we're all buying so many of those, we can't afford houses. Just imagine that. Like, you have this image of what an avocado looks like in your mind. It comes up, manifests in your inner eye. But that's not actually what they look like. That's your manifestation of what you think they look like. And it's this that I thought, well, hang on a minute. What if this was the same with my thoughts? what if this was all just a load of manifested noise and it didn't really mean anything? And that, all of this stuff around ego and self was just a lot of noise. So instead of trying to push these things away, instead of becoming in conflict with myself and going, stop criticizing yourself, stop thinking that, your mind must be quiet, which again is another load of bullshit. How can the mind be quiet? It's designed to think. I just got to this point where I just sat with it in the same way that I sat with the apple. I just sat with the thoughts, sat with the emotion, and I just let them exist and I let them go. And it was in that moment that I realized I didn't have to choose a thought. I didn't have to be binary in this. I didn't have to pick one or the other. Everything can exist at once. The fear, the self-doubt, the desire to grow, the ambition, the peace. There's no need to divide them into good or bad. They're just part of an experience that I was having in that moment. And that was my first glimpse at non-dual awareness. It's not about transcending the dualities of life, because I came at that meditation and, here come the dualities again. But it's about recognizing that the contrasts in those dualities are just part of a bigger whole. They don't need to be in conflict with each other. And more importantly, I didn't need to be in conflict with myself. It's quite funny because often in culture, we are taught to pick sides, aren't we? To define ourselves by what we stand for and what we stand against, what football team we support, what political party we follow. We see things as either or. Either I'm successful or I'm shit. Either I'm happy or I'm weeping in a corner. Either I'm spiritual or I love material things. Give me your readies. But life just isn't that simple. We contain multitudes. We can be both happy and sad, both strong and vulnerable, both spiritual and material. And when we let go of the need to constantly categorize and judge ourselves, we start to experience a deeper sense of completeness. This shift towards non-dualism has not, thankfully, been a one-time revelation, but it's something that I keep trying to return to over and over again because the pull of dualism is strong. I imagine me trying to get away from dualism is like I'm a fish in a river and this big angry fisherman has got his hook in my mouth and he's pulling me back. And that angry fisherman is dualism and the open river is non-dualism. And I'm the little fish going, fucking get off me, mate. I want to get out into the sea. But it just doesn't, burly bastard keeps pulling me back. What it has taught me, this little battle with the fisherman, is the way I relate to things. It's changed the way that I relate to people, because in the dual world, I would see relationships in very dual terms. It's me versus you. It's my needs versus your needs. My opinions versus your opinions. But when you start to see that these distinctions are just a part of the story, something shifts. You realize that the conflicts that we have with others often stem from the illusion of separateness, from the belief that we are fundamentally different or at odds with each other. When you peel back that illusion, you see that at the core, we're all the same thing. We're all part of the same experience, the same reality. That doesn't mean the differences disappear or that conflicts no longer arise, but it does mean that there's a greater space for compassion, for understanding, for empathy, for recognizing what affects one of us affects all of us. When we stop seeing ourselves as separate, it becomes much harder to be indifferent to the suffering or the joy of others. Ultimately, what non-dualism has taught me is that peace doesn't come from trying to erase or deny duality. It comes from recognizing that duality and unity are two sides of the same coin. The goal isn't to eliminate one in favor of the other, but to hold both perspectives with openness and flexibility, to move between them as life demands, and to trust that underneath it all, we are connected by something deeper than any division. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is all I have to say on the coexistence of dualism and non-dualism in spiritual thought. There's a mouthful for you. It's been a journey, from understanding the foundational concepts of dualism and non-dualism to diving into how they shape our philosophies, our psychologies, our spiritual practices, and even the world that we live in. One of the most important insights we've uncovered throughout this episode is that dualism and non-dualism are not just abstract ideas or opposing perspectives that we have to choose between. Instead, they offer us different lenses through which we can view and navigate life. Dualism, with its emphasis on separation and distinction, helps us make sense of the complexities we encounter in the world. It's practical, useful, and in many ways necessary. But non-dualism invites us to step beyond those distinctions and recognize the underlying unity that connects us all. It reminds us that the divisions we see are not the whole story, that beneath them lies a deeper truth of interconnectedness and oneness. As we've seen, dualism often shows up in our everyday lives, whether it's in our relationships, our sense of self, or even the way we engage with societal issues like politics and the environment. But when we rely too heavily on a dualistic mindset, we can end up feeling isolated, fragmented, and in conflict with ourselves and others. That's where non-dualism becomes a powerful tool for healing and integration. It offers us a way to move beyond the oppositions and recognize that at the deepest level, we are not separate from each other, from the world, or even from the divine. In reflecting on this balance between dualism and non-dualism, I'm reminded of something we touched on earlier, the yin-yang symbol. This symbol illustrates how opposites are not in conflict, but are complementary and interconnected. Light and dark, good and bad, self and other, they all exist in relationship to one another, constantly in flux, constantly flowing. And within each polarity lies the seed of its opposite. This is the dance of duality and non-duality. We don't need to reject one in favor of the other. Instead, we are invited to hold both perspectives with an open heart and a flexible mind. That is what makes these two perspectives so essential to our spiritual and personal growth. They remind us that we can live in the world of form, of distinctions and differences, while still tapping into the formless, the boundless unity that lies beneath it all. So, what can we take away from all of this? First, it's helpful to recognize when we're caught in dualistic thinking. When we find ourselves creating rigid categories or feeling disconnected from others or from ourselves, it's a sign that we may be operating too much from a dualistic mindset. In those moments, we can pause, reflect, and remember the deeper truth of non-duality, that we are all connected, and that the boundaries we perceive are not as fixed as they seem. At the same time, it's important to honor the role that dualism plays in our lives. It's part of the human experience to navigate contrasts and distinctions, and there's wisdom in recognizing that we live in a world where both duality and non-duality exist. The real growth happens when we learn to move between these two perspectives with awareness and grace, understanding that each has its place and purpose. Now I'm going to pose you some questions. Do you find yourself caught in black and white thinking, or labeling experiences and emotions as good or bad? Can you make space for both the dualities and the underlying unity they point to? Perhaps in your next moment of meditation or contemplation, or you're just gazing out at the sunset with a coffee in your hand, you can gently notice how dualistic thinking arises, and then take a step back to see the bigger picture, the oneness that connects it all. Ultimately, dualism and non-dualism encourage us to embrace the complexities of life without getting lost in them, to see the beauty in our differences while knowing that we are all part of the same whole. Thank you so much for joining me on this exploration. It's been this long exploration into dualism and non-dualism, and I hope that this has given you some insights and some reflection and some space for thought. And of course, thank you to everyone who has followed and subscribed to the podcast. It's a huge help to us to get it out there, to send the message. But it's also just really cool to see that people are kind of finding it interesting, and that, you know, someone's just listening to me prattle into a microphone for an hour about weird shit. It's great. Of course, if you did enjoy it and you're not subscribed or following, please consider doing so, because it just helps us to continue bringing you this sort of content and lets us know the sort of stuff that you might find interesting, so we can focus more on that content and not the stuff that nobody likes. As always, if anything in this episode has resonated with you in any way, then I would love to hear from you. You can share your stories via Patreon at patreon.com/theobservingeye, or on social media. You can find us on YouTube at youtube.com/@theobservingeye, and on TikTok and Instagram with the handle @theobservingeye as well. Take care, everybody. Much love, and I'll catch you soon.
You've been listening to The Observing Eye. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I hope it's been useful. And if you're interested in any more of my writing or work around psychology, philosophy, and general day-to-day living, please go and take a look at my Substack, which is theobservingeye.com. And that's I as in the letter, not I as in the gelatinous organ through which you see. Take care, everybody. Much love, and I'll catch you soon.